And we're live. Aside from the technical difficulties, we are here. Technology shown when it works beautifully. But when it doesn't, it just lets you down massively. Everyone, welcome and thank you for coming. Today we're going to discuss about something that usually we never discuss. That is AppSec pipeline. What the heck do we tell these dev how to fix stuff, and how do we help them getting to the point where we need? And in order to do so, we had a good friend that we have a good banter on this. So I think the conversation is gonna be good. Sean, do you wanna introduce yourself and give a little bit of background about you?
Sure. Thanks for having me. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. So I'm Sean Wright. I go by Sean Wright Sec on the likes of Twitter or X or whatever you call it now. Because I'm very creative, I go by the same name across all the platforms. I'm a principal application security engineer at a company called Featurespace. I've been involved in the tech industry for numerous years now. Started off as a developer and then moved into AppSec just over a decade ago. So been involved in that, seen a lot of changes for the better, and yeah, that's pretty much me.
Brilliant. And I'm Frank. Everybody knows me for AppSec and related rant about cyber risk quantification and the like, how to deal with dev security and the rest of the community. But we've been discussing offline a lot of late. And I think I realized by talking with folks around business and around non-AppSec specific that AppSec is something that not everybody understands. And I was surprised because, AppSec is easy, right?
Really
What?
simple, right?
Yeah. Why is AppSec complicated, Sean?
I think one of the reasons is it's I think there's several reasons, right? So one of them is the conflict between business and security. Businesses now want to get things out faster, and they have to in order to stay competitive with one another. If they don't, they're going to lose to the competitor, and that's not a good thing. So there's that aspect, and AppSec can be seen to slow things down. Developers also, they just want to work on the latest and greatest. I mean, I was a developer. You want to build things, you want to use the latest technology, you just want to pull things from all over the place. And from a security point of view, that can be very risky. So you have these people saying, no, you can't do that. You got to go follow these log processes, and they have all this tooling and extra hurdles to go through. So that creates a lot of conflict. And then at the same time, I think AppSec is still in a very immature state if you compare it to other areas of security. So if you go look at things like firewalls and your network security, and those have been around for a few decades now, where AppSec is still relatively young. In fact, in my previous role, I got asked, well, in terms of AppSec, what sort of standards in that are there? And there's actually very few. You can't go, well, do this PCI standard and you'll be great for AppSec. There's nothing really there solid for AppSec. It's getting better, but I still think we have some way to go. And then lastly, the volume is it's huge. Like most companies these days, even small companies, have some form of in-house development. So it's kind of everywhere. And I know everyone goes, "Oh, the skills shortage gap." I see this in AppSec. I'm trying to hire people, and it's very difficult to get someone with that development and security kind of experience. And I think that makes it even more complicated when you're trying to implement these things, getting the right people in with the right knowledge and the right approach.
And I totally agree with you. Getting the right people and the right approach, and then dealing with the millions of problem and the scale of the problem that any scanner throws at you. And if you're lucky, you have 1, 2, 5 AppSec people against a sea of development. And because you rightfully said you don't have standard, everybody develops in a different way. I recently discovered the beauty of people that are running parallel pieces of software with branches instead of merging the branches in main. And I thought that was like an exception. No, it's actually there's a whole culture about doing that. And sometimes you like, what is the standard? And there isn't a standard in that approach. And you're right. Like, how do you develop a standard API, a standard O2, a standard authentication method, a standard even login methods? Like, we seem to reinvent the wheel over and over and over.
Yep.
So how do we fix that? If we
I,
can fix that.
yeah, I think it comes down to tooling that. Another thing that we need to consider, it just occurred to me when you mentioned the different branches and that. A lot of software out there today is not new software. It's software that's been developed over years where we didn't have these strong security kind of practices at the beginning. We didn't have these great frameworks. I mean, now you get things like Spring frameworks and Python Django, and that they're all brilliant. But many applications out there are older, and they just kind of became piecemeal and plugged together. And I think many still are working on the premise of that, like the old days, the startup mentality where just get things done. And that's great for a small business, but you can't carry that onto a more mature business. I think in order to fix this awareness, working with developers, getting the right tooling in place. So tooling that does the security function but also works with developers. Developers can work with it. It's not an extra burden. It embeds within their ecosystem. So you're looking at things like IDE plugins, easy visual ways of finding vulnerabilities, preferably plugging into things like the ticketing system, Jira, the likes of that. And then, as I said, working with developers, getting their feedback, understand their pain points, also let them understand the why. So often, like this is my classic example I always use: cross-site scripting, right? Oh, there's a alert box. I've literally had this. Like, well, so what? The user's going to have alert box. No, show them what happens if you have a cross-site scripting. You can redirect the user to a malicious page, inject a beef hook, those kinds of things. Then show, oh, okay, this is now why I need to pay attention to this.
I think there is an aspect of that. I want to pick up maybe on a couple of things. IDE and feedback in IDE, I think absolutely great because is what I call just-in-time fixing stuff, where it is in front of you. If you made a mistake, I could reconsider this function. This is legacy, this is antiquated. You can make a decision there and then instead of like going back to a week and saying, oh, this piece of code, I don't even remember what I've wrote in here and why I wrote it. It's like, I don't want to see it again, and things like that. But then you have library upgrade, then you have things that pops up in operation, or 4,000 things that pops up in a backlog. Like those things, sometimes you can't make a decision there and then because, if we upgrade Spring Framework, you need to involve everybody that is developing a piece of code in that app. It's not just your particular line of code or your pull request. It's everybody else. So needs an all hands meeting, needs decisions, and those things. Nobody want to make a decision on upgrading from Java 0 to Java 6 because it's like, okay, now everything is deprecated. Okay, let's rewrite the app from scratch. Yeah, I think we can risk accept that issue.
Yep.
And that's the other challenge. Is like risk acceptance seems to be without consequences or risk not understanding from a business perspective. Because, I mean, if I talk to a product owner and I said, well, we need to upgrade from this Java to this Java, what it's going to ask is like, what if we don't? Well, we're going to get hacked. Well, what are the chances? Well, I don't know. And the conversation usually go, well, what is my risk? Can I get away with it? And things like that. There isn't a perception of that risk if we keep on talking, well, this is the problem, this is the vulnerability, and then period, we have to fix it.
Yep.
And hence dev don't get the time to actually do that work.
Yeah, Just touching on the risk acceptance, I've kind of seen it firsthand where people just go, "Oh, we'll just create a risk for that," and oh, sorry, exception, and exception actually became the norm. Like it was
Mm.
quite ironic. It wasn't an exception anymore. It was like the normal thing to do. And one of the reasons why I think it was such a, a thing is because no one had full ownership of that. When it's your
Mm.
name on something that could potentially get breached, it's or you have to go and answer to a customer why you made that decision. It suddenly becomes a lot harder for you to go, oh, we'll just accept it. It's now your neck on the line. Now, I'm not saying we should use it as a stick to beat people all the time, but it should be a case where whoever's asking for that thinks through very clearly what they're asking for and understands very clearly what the consequences are should anything go wrong. I think all too often they'll just go, oh, you know what, the security team will take full responsibility should something go wrong. Whereas if your name's there, it's going to be a lot harder to kind of watch that way. And they also don't understand what they're accepting. Like, if you
Mm.
accept this, you get breached, we lose customers, your team might be made redundant. Are you willing to accept that? Maybe, maybe not. Um, so yeah, it's
Sean, I think, can you come closer to the microphone? I think we got a comment that
sorry. There we go.
much
Should
better.
be a bit clearer. Apologies about that. But yeah, I think risk acceptance is something. And then in terms of like the wealth of vulnerabilities, uh, it's very difficult to work out what you should work on, what you should fix, especially if you're looking at things like open source libraries, where you just get a stream of CVEs. Um, there are thankfully things like EPSS score, so exploit prediction subscoring system. Dependency track actually does this really well, where they have on one axis your CVSS score, and then the other axis your EPSS score. So what you end up doing is having these quadrants or sections that you can then, okay, well, the top right are the ones that drop everything. We need to fix this now, and then you work your way down, and then you combine those things with something like CISA CAV, which is the known exploit vulnerabilities framework. Those are vulnerabilities that you know are being exploited. So it's not a question of, well, they could kind of hack us. This attackers are targeting this. Go fix those.
Yeah, I think it's, as I mean, EPSS, we're gonna have a whole panel on the 20th of October with Jay, that is from Scientia, one of the creator of EPSS. We've been a super fan of EPSS, probably one of the first product implementing EPSS, because like it's great, it's open source threat intelligence. We can actually focus on 10%, or we can exclude 90%, and then without the element, we can focus on the 1% that actually matters.
Yep.
But then on the other subject is, who the heck owns a piece of code?
Yeah, I've been down that route where you get some library someone wrote and they left the company and then no one takes ownership of that. And that's where I think a lot of risk comes in because ultimately it becomes stale. You have all these vulnerabilities and no one's willing to take those up. How you deal with that? It's not easy. You could play a hardball and say, well, no one takes ownership of this, we're going to block it. Until
Or you use
that's
it, you
maybe
own it. You...
exactly. Um, it, hopefully, it never comes to that, but that's why you need to again awareness, understanding. Like, look, this is a risk. You need to own this. If something gets breached, so on and so forth, and ideally, you should make if you're not getting anywhere with that, make it come from the top down. So your kind of CTO, even all the way up to your kind of CTO level, engineering director or whatever, and make them understand so they can then enforce and make sure that someone from their department or team owns that.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily need to go all the way up. As long as you have a product ownership, you can say you use it, you fix it. Like regardless that is
Yep.
a library that you own it, or is downloaded from somewhere else, or is a piece of code that somebody else has written it. Tough. You fix it, you use it, you own it. Maybe then you have a more collaborative approach with the CTO office, that maybe there are 5 teams that need to fix the same things. It's like, okay, let's pull it together, a target team, a tactical team where we fix these problems because they're high in EPSS, they're high in criticality, the likelihood of exploitation is high. There is an exploit that is kicking about. It's actually fixable. It just requires a bump and a bit of a regression testing. So let's all get our hands together and fix that problem. And I think it's that is the crux of what AppSec is having somebody that understand all these variable and all this logic versus having the SLA approach, having the meantime just gate approach, or like fix all the critical, fix all everything, fix everything by X date. That is, if you don't know AppSec, that's the only decision you can make. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, not every security team has an AppSec expert in there. And the approach is a blanket approach, a policy approach that I think is the worst approach ever, because then you end up focusing on everything. You don't even
Yeah.
consider prioritization.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're solely relying on CVSS, you're probably going to have a hard chance of being breached. Um, there, we actually had a call or webinar this morning where this topic got raised. Like some of the more worrying CVEs were like sevens, sixes, so they weren't that high up in the CVSS scoring, but they result in significant breaches. Um, so yeah, that blanket approach. I mean, it's even to a point like, especially with libraries, are you even using that vulnerable portion of that library? And that's where, thankfully, there is software that's getting more intelligent in that and being able to work out, okay, well, we have this vulnerable library. Is this code using that portion of the library? I totally agree. Like blanket approach, you're going to be wasting. You're going to be spending your wheels a lot of time and effort when in reality you could have that one little bug, or not even just one little vulnerability, but someone could chain vulnerabilities together. It could literally
Mm-hmm.
be that low vulnerability is the key to a successful exploit chain. Break that
Yeah,
exploit chain.
especially if it's used at scale, like going back to the likelihood of exploitation, the attack chain pattern. Like if it's something externally, even if it's a low, but then is highly exploitable. Well, maybe not a low, but maybe the medium, a 6 or 7. Um, there is the chance that somebody will take that, exploit that, especially if it's remote code execution or something that can be exploited without the use of any authentication, and then you're there, and then maybe you're focusing on fixing the backlog, or I don't know, the cafeteria app that is sitting down there because it's sitting on top of your backlog, and you have millions of problems reported. And I'm a little bit against the fixing everything in Jira, or integrating directly tools inside Jira, because that generate I see a million of these problems. Like I think
Mhm.
triage needs to go back to the state where it was, not necessarily manual triage, but at least a version of triaging, like using CISACAV, using uh,
Yep.
evidence-based exploitability, or probability-based exploitability, or risk, because all of this is risk.
Exactly. And one of the things I think people don't realize is threat intel now really needs to become a part of application security to start feeding in all these things. So not only relying on things like CSCAV and EPSS, go look at your WAF logs, see what the bad guys are trying to do against your
Hmm.
infrastructure. Um, see what the industry is. Like Log4j was a good example of this. Everyone lost their minds about Log4j, right? Like they went absolutely crazy. Um, but in reality, most organizations didn't have to panic about it because if you looked at your firewall rules, you would have seen that a lot of the things were just spray attacks, shoot and hope for the best. And the actual vulnerability, unless you had the code and the logs, would have been very difficult to exploit, nigh on impossible. So for most organizations with their own apps, it wasn't such a security risk as it was made out in the likes of the media and that. Um, so a lot of effort and wheels were spun trying to fix that and get all the log4j done. Meanwhile, you have all these other holes in your system. And also that creates a lot of panic. Your development team next time will be, oh, not again. Do we have
But there
to?
is a business perception. in that case. There was like a headline vulnerability everywhere, and the media is a little bit faulty of that. Also, everybody like is low exploitability, so it's low effort exploitability. So everybody could have chain it up or automate a script and running. So there were evidence, I think, in Log4j that yes, it was a low effort exploitability. You could actually weaponize it quite easily. So I think there was a relative concern, not the panic that it generated, because you could have said, we just fix the external stuff and then we ask our third party what it is, and then we'll treat it not overnight
Yeah.
um, as an overnight vulnerability. Now, the scary one are actually the one that you don't know, the uh, maybe the Spring for Shell, the OpenSSL, all the movie transfer kind of problems that are overnight you see the breach, or not overnight you see the potential
Yep.
aspect of it. But those you're never going to catch it. Like, even with the best threat intel, you're going to be maybe few minutes to an hour ahead of an attacker. um, and I think there is cyber resiliency, and is reacting to, and kind of ring fencing a problem um, rather than reacting or preventing. But all the other stuff is, as you said, is occasional, is looking at who is hitting you and what is the likelihood of exploitation of those things, and focus on those rather than focusing on everything else.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it also, we forget like security needs to be layered, right? Um, so in terms of your production servers, if you have a server pinging out to an IP address or domain that you have no idea, you should know exactly what that server is connecting to, or doing the outbound connections. You should know exactly. And if it does something not in that list, that should be an immediate red flag. Like, drop what you're doing, go look what's happening. And I think we've kind of lost sense of that. Those layered approaches. That server shouldn't even be able to make those outbound connections. To be honest, to domains or hosts that you don't know about. Inbound, it's going to be very much dependent on the service. So some servers will have to be open, wide open to the internet, but it's all those layered approaches. So yes, someone might compromise it, but then they should be kind of stopped in their tracks or have another just another step that they have to get through. And I think we kind
Yeah,
of lost that.
I do agree, and I think that the reason why we lost that is because there was a lot of digital transformation overnight with COVID. A lot of stuff was flinged across to the cloud, like literally flinged across to the cloud, and you had digital transformation where they said, "Okay, we need a secure cloud," and then all of a sudden nothing else worked because you didn't have documented legacy application how to communicate, and all of a sudden any everywhere,
Yep.
and you kind of lose that approach. But it's I think it's risk reward at that point in time, whereas like, yeah, the business needs to continue and survive. If you don't go digital overnight, you're probably not going to survive COVID, because maybe you have on-prem stuff that can't be accessed. So you had to bite the bullet as a business, risk reward, and maybe trying to fix it later. The problem is, as soon as you deploy something, don't touch it. Right?
Yep. Exactly. That fix it later. We'll get to it 5 years
Fix
later.
it never.
It's on the backlog.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
expanding
But
backlog.
honestly, if there was a backlog that was focused on this stuff, like the problem is we flinged everything critical, non-critical in the backlog, and then the backlog becomes just the death of technology debt. And nobody look at the backlog because it's like 2000. If we had a backlog of 10 top priority that are linked to the business criticality, like on the critical application you have zero backlog policy.
Yep.
Like the stuff that is business revenue generating, zero critical vulnerability or zero critical risk, and zero backlog item more than 2 weeks. That's a simple policy to implement and will protect 90% of your business, because you ring fence that two or three or five critical application against internal and external attacks.
Yep.
But we seem to have lost the logic, the business logic, or the logic to actually do these things and do the simple stuff first by focusing on fixing everything.
I mean, interesting. Like, I always see things like 0 Days and APT and all this, where if you read books, like one of the books I read was Lazarus Heist,
Hmm.
and it's where the Lazarus group, North Koreans, were targeting organizations.
Can you come a little bit closer?
Oh, sorry. They were doing targeting organizations, and their entry point for almost all of them were phishing attacks. And
Hmm.
you go look at recent breaches, again, phishing attacks. So the entry point will be phishing attack, and then once they're in that network, the network's generally pretty flat. So for them to pivot from system to system is quite easy. And if you target the right people, to me, if I was an attacker, which I'm not, I'd go for the devs. I'd go for your kind of DevOps folk, because they have so much access and they can do different things that often don't get scrutinized as much as, okay, well, someone from marketing is now going on this production server. What, what are they doing that for? Um, that to me is, is the worry. Like these, and we've seen it, right? We've seen so many instances where developers are explicitly being targeted by phishing attacks. They get their keys, credentials, and then suddenly the businesses and the media for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, I guess there is a wave of now SMS fatigue attacks or even IT service desk that we ignore it but have a lot of rights. Sometimes they have admin right of domain system, sometimes they have the ability to connect everywhere because that's their normal job. And we've seen a series of attacks that are trying to exploit that. I mean, Uber or few other that I heard of recently were bombarding with SMS authentication, and you just want it to be quiet, and you accept it, and that's it. Somebody's in, and it's low effort element. You still have to exploit a vulnerability. You still to deploy payload. You still have to do all the other stuff. Like once you're in, it's not like you're in. Even if it's a
Yep.
flat network, you still have to deploy RCE. But because we focused a lot on external and hardening external stuff, internal is like flat and soft. And as soon as
Yep.
somebody's in, like with Uber, it jumped from one to one to one. It just had to jump on two systems, and that's it. It got access to the key vault to everything in the world. It's like
Yep.
two system distance and a couple of credential and a couple of vulnerability exploited, and that's about it. I think there is the occasional things of protecting what's external from a business context perspective, but also focusing on what's more important from a business criticality perspective and fixing those vulnerability back. Again, fixing those vulnerability versus fixing everything else because it
Yeah.
doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And if you have
Absolutely.
controls, like if you have compensating control, if you have a WAF, like if you have other stuff, maybe something is not even reachable. Like the log4j, if you deploy a rule in the WAF,
Yep.
the chances that somebody could trigger that particular string was very low. So happy days, just fix everything else or put a timeline to fix.
Yep. Yep. I think at the end of the day, the biggest thing is being pragmatic about all this. You're going to have limited resources. Um, so don't panic when the big things come out, and apply the things that will gain you quick wins. So, like the log4j, a WAF. A WAF rule is not hard, it doesn't take long to implement, and that will give you a massive advantage and then buy you time to better prioritize the actual fix of log4j. Could be part of your next release, whatever. Like you can build that in. And that's where I think we see a lot of the panic is, okay, well, we need to drop everything, fix everything now. Where a lot of these things, you can put nice little buffers around them and then plan them in and do it properly.
Yeah, I guess from a business perspective, there isn't that perception though. There is a critical out there. There is a big thing out there. Let's fix them all or get me the plan to do it. If you communicate the risk properly and say, well, we could potentially miss all this other stuff. Probably from a business perspective, is risk against risk and time against time. They don't want to spend all day long to fix vulnerability, right? But
Yeah,
it's being,
exactly.
as you said, it's being pragmatic about it. It's taking that approach. But that sometimes require data, knowledge, ability to see what you have, right? Otherwise, you panic because you say, "Where the heck do we have log4j? Let's go and try to find it out." And in the meantime, you know, an attack could be happening or something else could be happening. So it's buying your time, but also I don't know, doing the legwork before, doing the asset inventory, doing your who owns what, where, which application is where. That we seems to never be able to do it because we never prioritize that. We prioritize fixes, well, we don't prioritize ownership and a mapping of everything else.
Well, that's what when Log4j came out, I wanted to scream in frustration because everyone was going, "Oh, Log4j, we're going to find out where we're using Log4j." Well, if you rewind the clock to 2017, we had Equifax breached by Struts.
Strats.
That should have been the alarm bells. Like, hey, people, you need to start doing an inventory of what software, what libraries you're using, where, so when a vulnerability comes out, you can go fix it with relative ease, not spend a lot of effort trying to figure out, well, what library you're using, where, what version, how we update it, and all of that. We didn't learn from that, which was the most frustrating part about it. The whole Log4j thing for me was that we didn't learn from Equifax.
Yeah, I guess though it made the way, it rang the alarm and made their way into regulation with the SPOM,
Yep.
Um, with the national mandate to actually do software inventory, at least on the library. They got misinterpreted because it's a blanket regulation, so it's fine. But at least it kicked the can down the road. It didn't kick the can down the road. It just action people to start doing inventory and start creating the problem of who, what application do we have, how important they are, and who owns them. Like three simple answer that if you need to do it at scale, you can just search, okay, let me see where Log4j is. Okay, which one are the systems that are actually externally facing? Okay, do we have a WAF in front of them? Like 10 minutes exercise versus a weekend of panic.
Yep, exactly. And
So
many late
back
nights
to
and many
business.
pizzas.
Yeah. And I mean, that's good for the pizza business after COVID, but
Yep.
but how do we go back and trying to explain that context back to the business? How do we ultimately we need to convince a business owner to spend time and effort and money on doing inventory? Nobody want to do inventory, and until the business is threatened with another Log4j, I mean, are we gonna ever learn, or you think SPOM regulation will start driving asset inventory?
I think there are a couple things in flight. So definitely the regulations. So as far as I know, in the US, if you want to do business with the government department, they're starting to enforce this. So you can't get away, or you might be able to postpone it, but not for much longer. Another thing I've seen is customers or clients are now starting to push a lot more on the security front. They're starting to ask a lot more questions. So from that point of view, yeah, you could delay it, but then one day you'll get a very pushy customer who's not going to take no for an answer, and that could literally break your deal. Maybe it's a multi-million dollar or pound deal. Um, so I think those things, the more customers start pushing, the more people are going to realize, okay, we're going to have this. Another angle that you can take is try to do tabletop exercises that could involve a bit of time, but cut out 2 days, see how well prepared you are for like something like Log4j. Vulnerability comes out, remote code execution. How quickly can you update that? And how quickly can you get that patch out? You'll learn a lot from that. And that may drive all of this. Okay, well, we're missing the S bombs. It's going to take us extra time, so on and so forth. And then you do up the pros and cons. Okay, if we do this now, it's going to save us 20 hours during the crisis.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's like I think table topic exercise and threat or light threat modeling exercise where you ask a simple question and you see the panic seeping in everybody's faces. That's I think
Yep.
it's a good way to approach it because you can start testing the water before an attack ever happen, and is in good regulation. Is actually required from business resiliency, ISO 90 something something. certification. So there are certain certifications that ask you to run this business disaster exercises and what happened and what you have under the hood. I guess it's again convincing the business to actually do the hard parts, because AppSec tend to be hard. I mean, infrastructure and vulnerability management is the same problem. It's like asset inventory, who owns what. At least from the code, you have the maintainer file that you can look at. But from an infrastructure perspective, who bloody owns that server that got bought by X amount of days
Yep.
ago? So
Yep.
I guess you,
I
you
think
have you have a you have a problem in
oh
there as well.
yeah. Sorry, I was going to say I think with like cloud, and DevSecOps and that, especially the model. I don't know if you know the like Spotify type model where you have
Hmm.
individual teams owning everything. So that includes infrastructure, so they can just spin things up on a whim, um, and then that just makes it harder to understand who owns what unless you have the right procedures and processes in place to make sure. Like if you're doing AWS, you might have the right tagging and that kind of thing. Um, so many organizations get breached because they don't have appropriate asset management. That one server sitting there that Joe Blogs or Anne or whoever created, and they left the company and no one knew it was running, suddenly gets breached and the attackers are in.
Yeah, I guess with the cloud it's easier and it's harder as well. Like there is a way to trace asset, there is a way to tag things, but you need to be baked in the standard model, in the standard operating model. Um, Otherwise, you have the same problem of ownership. I guess with the scanning ability, having an asset inventory in the cloud is much easier with config and few other things. So we have the technology. The technology has evolved to actually do that exercise. We just need to get the bloody work done. And I think, as you rightfully say, it is get the business perception in. Like, do that exercise and say, if we were to do this at scale in a panic mode, we would have lost like 6 times over. And I think that's the perception, the probability, and the risk level, and the realization that you say, okay, if you were to do this in a panic mode, this is the likelihood that this exercise will fail, and this is the likelihood of you going to be breached, because when the fire is starting, you're in the mix, you have to dance.
Yep.
But who's going to take that fall versus the traditional approach that is, okay, let's put a gate, let's fix everything by SLA.
I think when we have these conversations with the business, we have to talk on their terms, right?
Mm.
This is how much money you're going to lose. Really, that's what matters to the business. And if we can quantify that, 6 hours, right, you're going to lose 30,000. The other thing that I have a problem with referring, and it's kind of hard because a lot of breaches in the media happen with large organizations. Guess what? They can ride that wave out. They can ride that initial really hard wave. They have a lot of financial resources to survive that. Just recently, I think it was yesterday or something, there's a haulage firm in the UK that's now gone under because they suffered a ransomware attack.
Mm.
Smaller organizations need to realize if you're going to get hit, that's going to have a massive impact and potentially close your business. Those are the things that we have to get through to leadership, especially if you're in a smaller organization. You're not going to have that comfort zone. And as I said, like at the end of the day, it's talking the business language.
Yeah, it's I guess that there was the old perception of like, I'm small, who's gonna look at me? But right now ransomware is so mechanized, is so spread across, is like so opportunistic that everybody's gonna get hit. And they're gonna negotiate with you the amount of ransom, even if it's 1 pound, is 1 pound spread across the globe. And probably it's not 1 pound, but it's much more than that. And that could mean your business goes under and you will never recover, or the data's going to get ransomed. And not because you're small, you're not going to get targeted, because there are automated systems that do that at scale. And then eventually they're going to spend the resources that they gain from that to actually attack the big boys that have possibly more resource, or maybe more layers and more gates. Like it's a attacking system and attack group. I think I read the other day that there was no anymore one single attacker, but they're only attack group because they're getting together. The system are becoming more complex. We are getting hopefully better, but they're getting better at the same pace that we're getting better. Like they're implementing LLMs, they're implementing methodology of attack to actually script it, um, and automate all of it, and they don't care who they target. As you say, they spray and pray, and then who they find it, happy days.
So you want to hear a story about a small organization? I used to work in a
Should.
very small organization many years ago, like when I first began my career, and they didn't have any security. And I said to them, "Look, you need to get this in." And I still remember these words clearly from my boss at the time. Who's going to hack us? I'm like, "You're going to get hacked." A few years later, someone phoned me. Sean, I wish you were here. Got a phone call from the hosting company. They got breached. The attackers were hosting pornography from their servers.
Oof.
So anyone can get breached. Anyone.
Yeah, I guess that's the message that we want to send across, and then to conclude that anybody can get breached. The best time to do asset management is not when is everything on fire. Understanding AppSec is complicated, but an organization like OWASP that offer cheat sheet, that offer solution like um, dependency tracker like Cyclone DX to do SBOM in your pipeline in a relatively simple way, and get at least that element together. To start doing it, but not when everything is on
Yeah.
fire. Like start making the business case when, like as you rightfully said, when you can do a table topic exercise, not everything is on fire, and you can actually have the time to dedicate and to have that discussion all together.
Yeah. Uh, I've been involved where there was an incident, and it's not pretty. People panic. It's so many things are going on. You have very little coordination because there's just so many things going on, and this is why tabletops are so important. You don't have the time during an incident. Tabletops, you have the time. You can sit down, fix things, reanalyze things, and more importantly, assign appropriate owners. When it's happening, that goes out the window. So you want to make sure this is structured. That otherwise you end up with things like that. Ages ago, the talk breach. I'm not going to repeat what was said, but silly things being said that just make a bad situation far worse.
Yeah, it's because you don't think like, and the table topic exercise helps you as well. First of all, realize where you have the hole, and second of all, realizing if you have a script, how are you going to react to that script? Like, okay, let's look at our critical application. Do we have critical application? Okay, now that we know what our critical application is, do we have owners? Who the heck owns this? Oh, we have these libraries here. Oh, who the heck owns this library? Is it a shared one? Is it like all those questions are like could be knocked down in days, and you could start very small and very simple on this exercise and realize so much and get it done and get it justified, also from the business, in a fairly straightforward way. The challenge is there aren't a lot of us out there, as you rightfully said. There isn't a lot of AppSec people out there. Unfortunately, people in AppSec are expensive because they're rare resources and they're highly skilled. So not a lot of small business can afford it. Like that's thank God there is OWASP that helps on that with guideline and approach. But technology is out there as well to help small organizations to fix things. That's why we did a commitment on OWASP to actually help all the small business owner to actually run, assess, and do their inventory at scale for free.
Yep.
That was one of our mission to actually help everyone get more resilient all in one go with a collaboration with OWASP and the freemium edition. What will be your final last thought on like small, medium, and large enterprise on how to get better at explaining AppSec and get better at AppSec?
So I think it comes back to my previous point where we have to focus on the why, make sure people understand why is it so important. I think as soon as they realize the why part, the rest will help fall into place. One of the most challenging things is the culture, getting people to buy into security, not see it as this roadblock. Um, as I mentioned, customers are starting to expect more. So the why combined with uh, customers are now starting to ask these questions. It could literally be a roadblock to that contract. So security is no longer this no value add thing. It could literally be that showstopper to you gaining that multi-million-dollar thing. So people's perceptions need to change, and I think that starts with the why.
I like that. I like starting with the why. If you haven't, for who's listening, if you haven't read the book, Start with the Why from Simon Sinek is a great, great book to focus on not how to fix things, not what to fix, but actually why we should fix specific thing. And that's what business understand. So it's easier to explain. Anyway, I'm not going to rumble around philosophy of business and security because otherwise we're here all day. Sean, thank you so much for coming on the show. We had some technical glitch, but we actually made it.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Good stuff. Is there any question from the audience for Sean that you want to know around application security, especially if you're in dev or you're not in application security? Do you have a question for Sean? I think we have a couple of minutes more. Yeah, I had a couple of questions around the mic.
Yeah. So interestingly, well, waiting for questions. The mic is because I've got NVIDIA broadcast, which works really well, but if you move too far away, it detects it as background noise and cuts you off.
Oh, so you've been detected as false positive.
Exactly.
Hey, Sam. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, brilliant. We come at the time. So thank you everyone for listening. It's been a pleasure, Sean. Thank you for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. Super fun conversation as always. Thank you very much,
Great
everyone,
being here.
and stay safe.
Thank you.